Welcome to the Journey Podcast, a show about health, wealth, and happiness. My name is Adam Bruderly, and I am joined by my co-host, Michael Baker. Whether you're looking to revamp your lifestyle or seeking a spark of inspiration, join us on this journey and let's explore the world your health and wealth make possible.
All opinions expressed by Adam and Michael and any podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Journey Wealth. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for any health or financial decisions.
Welcome back to the Journey Podcast. Today we are joined by Nicole Pucci. She is a psychologist specializing in working with children and adolescents. She is dedicated to understanding and addressing the unique needs and challenges they face in the current environment. Besides her professional expertise, she is an advocate for mental health awareness in educational institutions and actively participates in community outreach programs. Beyond her professional work, she is a wife, mother, daughter, and a Girl Scout troop leader. Nicole, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Adam. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, appreciate it. I think we're going to start with an easy one. How did you arrive at this journey into kind of the youth space specifically? Was there a particular event or something that kind of pulled you into this world, or was it more you knew this was where you wanted to go?
Yeah, Actually, it's kind of fun to reflect on the journey. But I think I always knew I wanted to do something with children. So when I was in high school, I was probably hemming and hawing between education and psychology. And both of those are really focused on kind of a helping profession. But I did have a really impactful experience as a high schooler. I was tutoring at one of the local elementary schools. And somewhere along my senior year, I was working with a fifth grader who we had worked together for a number of weeks, but in one of the weeks leading up to the end of the school year had revealed that she was being physically abused at home and lifted up, her sleeve to show some pretty significant bruising. And I remember, it stands out very specifically for me because I remember feeling really powerless in that moment in a way that I wished I could help more. And I remember feeling like that was so courageous of this very young person to be able to speak about something that was probably so incredibly difficult for her to bring up. And, as one does in high school, you talk with the teacher and the school psychologist and get the girl to the appropriate spaces, because I certainly was not trained in any way to manage that at the time. But I remember thinking how much I admired those individuals in being able to help that young girl, and that I wanted to learn tools and skills to be able to do the same. And so if that was my senior year, from there, it really became very clear that I wanted to specialize in psychology and understand not just how to help kids like that, but also the root causes of why things like that happen in family systems. And I went to Purdue University, where I did a very heavily research-focused honors program. And then I worked during the summers at one of the Cleveland hospitals being a junior camp counselor for a treatment program. And I loved it, which also told me that I was probably on the right path, right? If you're doing that day to day and you're still enjoying it. And I stayed at this particular Cleveland hospital after college and continued to really enjoy it. And from there, did go on to get my PhD in clinical psychology from Case Western Reserve University, which was a spectacular training and learning experience. And gosh, now I've spent about 10 years in an educational institution in Cleveland that has been a great chapter in my life. And I've just recently launched my own practice with a couple locations in Cleveland. So that's kind of the whole story in a nutshell.
That's amazing. Well, one, thank you for sharing the story. I think it sounds like you had an inflection point early in your life that really kind of sent you down this path. It's something we talk about at the firm when we talk about the 4 pillars of wellness, specifically your why. So, it's amazing just to hear how you found that so early, first and foremost. Yeah. The second piece of that is kind of your experience the last decade or so. And as you step out into your own practice, which again, congratulations on.
Thank you.
What I'd like to understand is kind of your time over that last decade, from the, early on, right? From the 10 years ago till now, what have you seen among that demographic? And what I mean by that is, from that preteen, teen, early college, and maybe a little bit beyond that.
Right. Right. So I think that's what's interesting about it, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit later, is how much change I have noticed as a clinician, both in the school system, but also in my training from 18 years ago to 12 years ago to now. And I would say the majority of young people I work with, the most common, probably the most common symptom profiles that I work with are anxiety and depression. But the rates in which we're seeing that, as you know, as the data shows, are skyrocketing. And they were on that trend pre-pandemic and have either increased or just completely stayed, probably increased, and have not decreased at all since COVID. And I think that's really startling when I think about, relative to a lot of psychologists, I'm still considered early career. And if I notice that change, that tells me a lot about where this trajectory has gone and where we're kind of at in terms of helping young people find their path.
Yeah, I think to your point on the data, you have a strong academic background. I tend to take the bro science approach. And I think there's a stat that I was reading the other day. Major depression among teens since 2010, for boys, it's up 161%. And for girls, it's up 145%, right? Those are shocking numbers. And there's a plethora more that kind of sit underneath that. I think the term you used, anxiety, stress, depression, I mean, there's a multitude of terms that we could pull out.
Sure.
When you think about, for example, that statistic in which you have seen, and I would actually mention, you said 12 years ago, which I think is really interesting because maybe we'll talk a little bit about this too. There's a few things that have happened right around that time frame that, I think we've saw early on grow in a linear perspective. And I think now what we're seeing, it's growing at an exponential perspective. But with those stats and what you have seen, what are some of the things that you would look to or pull out from that?
Well, I think there's several, probably, right? As we think about it, one that I know we're going to talk about a little bit today is technology and social media, and I think it is a really important contributing factor. But I think there's lots of things that I've noticed teens telling me about. I mentioned teens because that's the bulk of who I work with has been preteens and teens, specifically in the last decade, and so not only is it technology and social media, but it's also the landscape in which kids are being raised today. I think, kids are so incredibly attuned, even from a very young age, as to the conversations around them and what they're hearing. And, there's a 24/7 news cycle happening that is largely based, as we know, on like negative news, right? About the state of the world, about political divisiveness, about divisiveness in their own backyards. And I think that plays a role in it. I think certainly social media changes the way we've had in-person connections, and that changes the way they socially interact and how they grow up. And I also think, we're all trying to figure this out as adults and the teenagers themselves. We're trying to figure out how to navigate something that hasn't really ever been navigated before. We're learning on the fly, right? And there's a lot that's coming out about that. There's a lot of data and research and, recent calls to action, specifically in the past few months. But all of that together really is a combination of probably exacerbating pre-existing kids who would have already had pre-existing anxiety and depression.
Yeah, I think, one, thank you for sharing those key components. I would wholeheartedly agree in terms of, right, like social media is the one that is kind of flashing on the wall for many people, I think. But there is many things to that. I think you mentioned parenting. I have a 9 and a 6-year-old, right? To your point, doing it on the fly, very much so.
Yeah.
And I want to throw out two terms that get tossed around, at least when I think about it, right? Relatively newer, but have been happening probably for a few decades. Helicopter parenting and snowplow parenting. And I tend to think about those, and you can probably put a little more context around them. But I would toss you those two terms, and as we're just talking about the parenting component, and we'll get into the other things. But when you hear those two terms, do you think those have kind of fallen into that landscape? I think about my own childhood as someone who grew up in the 90s, and then think about the experiences now and the dichotomy from then till now, and in those two terms kind of mixed in.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways it makes sense. Why parents are doing it. I'm sure at moments I have probably fallen into a little bit of that myself. And what I mean by particularly like the snow plowing parent, I think parenting has become such a verb, right? Like in ways that previous generations maybe didn't do it. Like it feels like there's a very specific path that you're supposed to be taking, even though we know that every child is different and there's no one path. But I think what happens often is that parents are so well-intentioned and love their kids so much that they really don't want to see them go through pain or to have mistakes or to fail, right? That's scary. It's unpleasant for kids to experience. It's unpleasant for us to see our kids in pain. And so what sometimes happens is we try to make things easier, which of course makes sense in the short run. But then what ends up happening in the long run is that the kids themselves haven't maybe learned or just haven't learned how to tolerate distress, like uncomfortable emotions that are part of human everyday life, how to navigate, how to get themselves back up, with some support from a parent, but how to really take control of that piece. And I think when we've snowplowed everything so much for them, then these kids really, they don't also have like a great sense of agency that they can do it on their own, which the inverse of that is if we can be supportive, but allow our kids to have opportunities where it might end in disappointment or they can tolerate distressing emotions, they learn that they have more power over that than they may have initially thought. And that builds greater resilience and a greater ability to be able to function more independently as we think about launching them, later as teenagers or into college or into adulthood. But it's not easy. I am a parent myself. It's not pleasant or fun to watch your kids go through really difficult experiences, and that only becomes harder. Our kids are still really young. I've watched parents go through this challenge with teenagers, and it's not easy to do. But then I think part of what I like to do when I work with parents is remind them and redirect them to that, like, this might be a bump, but it's not a detour, right? And that this feels really painful right now, but they're actually going to come out of it with more growth and knowing how to manage things on their own in a way that's going to build more resilience later.
Yeah, I think so you're saying it's okay that I refuse to let my kids win ever until they actually beat me. So I'm taking that one.
That's so funny because my husband just said something similar about a card game my daughter likes. Like, I can't let her win. So there you go. I guess you could perceive it that way.
All right, good. I feel better. Too, I agree in the sense that, I said mine are 9 and 6, so I have a little bit to go.
Yeah.
But your time, within the education system the last 2 years, so everything you just shared, right? You're dealing not only with the kids, but the parents, right? There's the tremendous intersection. Could you share, what you just stated in terms of all those dynamics? Where have you seen that play out in your actual experience in the system? And meaning, hey, it could be something at the school, something at home, and then how you would tackle that issue in terms, in your role.
So, for example, something that comes up a lot when we're talking about social media or we're talking about sleep or we're talking about kids' schedules nowadays, or when I say kids, I'm talking broadly about teens too. But I think one of those things is that it can be really unpleasant for parents to set boundaries or to set limits or to say no. And sometimes I think their fear is grounded in this really genuine place of like not wanting to damage the relationship they have with their kid or their teenager. And, teenagers can be irritable and can have conflict anyways, right? But they're trying so hard to really keep that rapport together that they're afraid to put the boundaries in place. And something I talk about with parents and that I really try to practice a lot in my own life is that limits and rules and saying no to things are actually really healthy. And we have lots of research showing that when kids know where the line is or what the rule is, they're actually much better able to function and play and be with their friends and stay within those rules because there's safety in that. Like, that's actually really reassuring for kids. And it ends up leading, like, they probably don't love having a curfew set, and that might be a very short-term conflict, or they don't like that you set limits around when the laptop has to go off at night. But overall, it actually leads to less conflict because once they know what the established rule is and everyone in the family can kind of be on the same page with that, then it's less opportunities for conflict and has a healthier dynamic to it. But that doesn't always come easily or naturally, right? And so I think of that a little bit as also some of the challenges I see parents having today with with wanting to build the relationship and not wanting to upset them, but inadvertently it kind of backfires.
Yeah, I think it's funny. There's a stat around that again, and I think it was something of the sorts that, kids who have boundaries in terms of screen time, social media use, all this, they're actually, they don't feel the same mental health effects in that association, right? Like those boundaries are put in place. And I see that, for example, as the coach at the firm and doing those things, I think about it in the sense of, I'll help clients, right, from a growth perspective. And instead of saying, go out and try this, right? And there's the risk of trying something and it going completely off the rails. You try to put, to your term, guardrails or put them in a space where you can fail safely.
Yep, 100%.
So with that being said, let's, pivot over to that social media component. Because again, I think it is a big topic now more than ever. And we could rattle off statistic after statistic. And I will kind of tie all these together, but I want to start with a couple stats. So right now, on average, teens are spending 4.8 hours on social media a day and an additional, 3 to 4 hours on screens. And that doesn't incorporate homework. So anywhere right between 8 to 10 hours a day is spent on screens and phones. So stats can be anything and they can be manipulated or used in any way you want. But what I'd like to ask is, hearing that statistic, is that something that you saw in your time? Or do you think those are pretty accurate?
I think those probably are accurate. Definitely. I would say there might be some adjustment in terms of, if it's a season that a teenager is really involved in a sport or an extracurricular activity, but it would not be uncommon, is my guess, nationally, for kids to be on social media 4 to 5 hours a day.
So, kind of establishing that piece of it, what have you seen? So that's back to that 12 years ago. And 12 years ties very well to the launch of the iPhone, to the launch of the App Store, to the growth of social media, right? At Facebook, Instagram, TikTok now, Snapchat, right? We could rattle off a multitude of those things. But that 12 years in looking at the data, and we could cite, right, the growth of anxiety, depression, suicide, unfortunately, right? And all the things that kind of come in that space. So could you walk me through kind of your experience, not only in kind of the educational space, but just in your work as a clinician, in everything you're seeing?
So I think something so anxiety and depression was probably the pieces, the two primary symptom profiles I've seen the most, regardless of what stage of my training or work that I was in. But what did end up coming up more frequently was like self-esteem issues being related to how they're perceiving themselves based on what they're seeing online, whether that's their own friends, kind of curated images, whether that's influencers. It's come up a lot around TikTok in particular, although I'm sure that's true of other ones too, and how they feel about themselves afterwards. And we do a lot of when I hear that come up, and they're spending that many hours a day, we do have very real conversations about, well, let's look at your time spent this week on it. And what are you following? How do you feel about what you're seeing? How do you feel after you get off social media? Let's reframe and kind of dive a little bit into like, when you're seeing something on social media, how realistic is that image? Like that snapshot in time, what's actually happening behind this photo, do you think? And they're able to rationally do that. But we know that, I think it was, the Surgeon General just had an op-ed in the New York Times about a warning label. And my organization, the American Psychological Association, was just doing a conference where Dr. Mitch Pristine was talking about like how addictive this can be. Like if you replaced the word of a drug and put social media in, we're seeing a lot of the same withdrawal, difficulty, difficulty controlling their usage of it. A lot of the same symptoms with kids who don't have fully developed brains, right? And we as adults, I mean, it can be addictive for us too. It's designed to keep us, the algorithms are designed to keep us on there. So I wouldn't have heard, I might have heard about, I certainly would have heard about peer differences and peer relationships 5-10 years ago. That's always been true. But the way it's playing out online with people they know or don't know has been a startling difference.
Yeah, thank you. That's good perspective. And I think to your point on a couple of those things, right? Like the label or social media warning, right? The Surgeon General has kind of two big ones the last 18 months. And I think they're actually highly correlated, both for adults and teenagers. One, loneliness and isolation as an epidemic in the United States. And there's stats around that for the youth specifically. I think, for example, from the 2000s till now, teenagers used to spend, see their friends 3 times a week, and it's down to 1.5, right? So, I mean, literally cut in half. Same is applicable for adults. We know that's true. And now the kind of the social media warning, which is a key piece of it. And some of Jonathan Haidt's work, he talks about 4 harms from social media: social deprivation, sleep deprivation, cognitive fragmentation, and addiction. And that's a term you just used momentarily. Of those 4, what concerns you the most, or how would you, think about that? Because I think what we want to do is just start to establish the baseline of this is what I'm really seeing in my work directly, right? Boots on the ground, for lack of a better term. And then more importantly, right, after we get the negative components out, like start to understand what can be done from your expertise.
Yeah. So I would say the same thing to teenagers and parents. Like, I don't want to believe that anything is all good or all bad. Social media is here. There are uses that can be helpful with it. But like anything, we probably have to be really conscious about how we're using it and the frequency and duration of it. And that's what I tend to spend some time with teenagers talking about. Not that we have to completely stop it altogether. I don't think that's realistic. And I think there's things that kids do get out of it at times. But how do we, whether it's putting our own limits on it, whether it's like, gosh, following this set of influencers doesn't appear to be very helpful. So what would happen if you unfollow them for a couple of weeks? Let's do that and see how you feel afterwards. Right. We do things like that. And then the biggest part really is just trying. I spend a lot of time not necessarily focusing on what kids shouldn't be doing, because there's nothing kids and teenagers dislike more than that, but what they can do, what can they do more of, right? So reflecting on like, gosh, when you do see your friends, how do you feel after that? Like in person, or how was it to spend time doing that after school activity or that club or that athletic event, or even just going to support a friend in a club or athletic event. And you do notice how they report that experience differently, right? There's something about camaraderie or not feeling as lonely as one does when they're alone scrolling their phone. And then the important thing is that they can make that connection for themselves. Because what often I like, when possible, for teenagers to have those aha moments themselves, because that's so much more impactful in trying to change any kind of patterns or behaviors. And they do often notice it. Some of them know it right from the start and come in asking me for help with it. But for others, they can tell the difference when they're in person with people and connecting.
Yeah. I mean, I think the connection piece is huge, right?
Yeah.
I mean, right? Like I even think about in this role, for example, podcasts. Right. I've been on a number of them. We do them here, and I'll do a number of them, and it'll be virtual, right? It'll be someone located somewhere else. And just that experience of sitting across from someone, the dynamic, the ability to just reach out, right? Like it's a totally different feeling and experience. And then you think about taking that, for example, in a professional dynamic and applying that to your friendships and the relationships you have, right? I have really close friends kind of scattered about the country from living out west. And right, I can talk to them, I can FaceTime, but that feeling is totally different when I'm sitting down with them in whatever environment it is.
Right.
So you mentioned that. So if a teen walks into your office, right, like in your time at the school or now in your practice, what are kind of 2, 3, 4 things when they come in perhaps with that issue or something that kind of is a byproduct of that? I'm sure there's a lot of work to get right to the end result, which I completely understand. But if you cut through that a little bit, what are 2 or 3 things either as someone listening to this, perhaps as a parent, can take away and say, hey, I'm seeing this, the things you just talked about, what can I start to do?
Right. So I think, and right now, I mean, we're talking a lot about social media, and I think it's one factor. A lot of the clients I see have other factors at play for what is happening with their anxiety, depression, or symptoms such as that. But a couple things that I think can be really helpful. In addition, so I think the loneliness epidemic that the Surgeon General has mentioned and that we're seeing, I think encouraging as parents in-person real-time connection. And I think that can look like, it can take a lot of different formats, right? And it depends on the developmental age. So if you're talking about young kids who usually aren't on social media, or certainly not as frequently, they want so badly to have one-on-one time with parents, right? And that is just like, that brings them so much joy. It's so rewarding for them. And if we're talking about slightly older kids, you'd be surprised that parents do play such an incredible role in terms of still providing comfort and reassurance. And teenagers really do still get a lot out of that. In terms of teenagers, we also know that their friendship circles are hugely important at this point in time. So either, if that means trying to help be a chauffeur and getting them to see their friends, or offering to drive them to something at the school where they can connect, or letting them stay late to participate in an after school activity, that I think is amazing. And if you're a parent listening whose kid doesn't have a lot of friends, there's lots of ways to get your kid involved in something that might help them feel less lonely. And a big thing that I do a lot of is help them find their purpose a little bit. So maybe it's something they're interested in volunteering in. Maybe it's something that they, I've had students who volunteer at animal shelters. I've had students who volunteer and tutor with other kids, and that gives them that connection, even if you're worried that your kid doesn't have a lot of same age peers. So the in-person connection piece is really, I think, critical. And then the other thing is, since it's not going away anytime soon, I do often talk with parents about, okay, so Johnny, for example, is spending a lot of time on video games and often it's the video games where you do play with other peers. You can tell how much I know about this by the way I'm talking about it. But similar to what they'd be doing in real life, take an interest in what they're interested in. So we would do that with sports or activities, hopefully most parents do, and learn a little bit more, ask the kind of questions about what it is they're spending time on, or tell me about that game, or what is the purpose of the game, and how do you win the game? How do you play with your friends? I get it. You might get eye rolls out of teenagers sometimes, but believe me, they are listening, and they do really value when parents are invested in what they find really interesting. So in-person connection, making time to partake in their interests, I would say. And then the other one that we haven't touched on at all is sleep. But that's a big one that I do think phones have had a role in the lack of sleep that kids are getting, or not just phones. I think also probably doing homework late at night. So talking as a family, I mean, if you're a 2-parent household, setting those boundaries as the two of you of what time you want kids turning off the laptop or turning off the phone. And then that really can, even minor tweaks, sleep seems like such a huge one for parents to overhaul. They are oh, that's too big. I can't possibly touch that. But even if you make small adjustments, little by little, it can lead to a really big difference. So I'm a big believer in what can you do that's tangible and small right now? And then it can lead to more adjustments later. So I think those would be 3 kind of big things that could be practical for parents to be using.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. I would agree with all of those. I mean, to the point where I was woken up at 7 a.m. this morning by a 9 and a 6-year-old to walk downstairs. College football came out today, the college football game. And
okay.
it's been 11 years since it's been around. So I remember playing it in college.
You mean a college football video game?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, it's been all over every website, right?
I'm sure I'll hear all about it from my brothers, but.
So they had it pre-ordered. They paid for it themselves. They scrapped their cash together. But they wanted me to come down at 7 this morning from the gym. They came out to the gym and they're like, "Can you watch us play?" I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I had to watch Ohio State play some made up team and they won 100-0. But like, but it just resonates, right? Because it's exactly what you're sharing.
Yeah.
And the other items you mentioned, right? Like the friendship, the relationship, the loneliness, and the sleep. I mean, what really strikes me is, again, in my role at the firm, kind of in the wellness space and as a coach, is everything you're sharing, I see show up within the adult side. And now even more so, right?
Yeah.
You know, for example, the relationships, right? Like there's a statistic, again, back to the stats stuff, but 1 in 5 men right now cannot say they don't have friends. Somewhere between 3 and 5 can't name the friends they say they have, right? Like, and you know, whatever that means, or you can unpack it, but it's basically saying, hey, I don't have a strong network of friendships and relationships. And you're seeing that from adult men all the way down, right? Like, you know, we could dive into the boys' data, but it's tough, right? Yeah. They're retreating in a lot of different ways. And then the sleep and the technology and everything, right? Like we're talking again about teenagers, but you know, devices in a bedroom for adults, devices at a table, right? I think now it's somewhere around on a day, an adult will check their phone somewhere between 100 to 120 times a day. It's like, and some yet, staggering
Adam,
thing.
I'm like, if someone was counting how many times we both look at our phones, I believe that, right? Even though I'm like so aware of the research and not that particular stat, but I know about it. That doesn't surprise me somehow.
Yeah, I mean, and why I mention it is what you in your work now, right? You're speaking to the kids often, but how do you translate? Because you may be seeing, right, like. You know, someone shared a stat with me that, you know, especially for younger kids, right, you know, of what they take away from you, 90% or so of that is nonverbal and 10% is verbal, right? And that could be off, of course. But then I just think about my own experiences, the anecdata, and I feel like there's a lot of truth to that. So how do you address that where you're sitting there telling, hey, don't put the phone away at a certain time, like have these habits, do these things, and it doesn't translate?
Well, I think you probably hit it right there, is that kids of all ages, particularly teens, but even younger, are super perceptive, as I mentioned earlier, to adults around them. And, you know, part of that is modeling it. And it's really hard, right? We know, similar to kids, we might have more developed brain. We do have more developed brains, but the algorithms and the phones can be similarly attention pulling for us too, right? Like we know that if a phone is on the table, our attention is going to be pulled to it. And so part of that is trying to model it as best you can, that like if you want to have dinner as a family without the phones away, then you have to make sure your phone's away too, right? Or, and I've been known to do emails in the evening as well, but I have to like remind myself sometimes to be like, okay, when I'm here with my kids, I'm going to try really hard to be present in the moment, short of an emergency. And then like I'll email I'll respond to a few emails once they go to bed or something. And I'll kind of try to compartmentalize my time like that with digital media. And, you know, I'm human. That's not always easy for me either to do, but that's part of the conversation, right? Is if we want kids to take it seriously, we have to also make some adjustments to how we interact with it as well.
Yeah, 100%. Right? I think about that just in my own practice, and as I sit across from clients, and like, how am I showing up?
Right. Oh, gosh, there's like nothing worse than you're trying to have like a meaningful conversation with someone and they pull out their phone and you're like, oh man. And I'm understanding about that kind of stuff a lot, but like it does. Like the moment just kind of, it disrupts the moment. Yeah.
It's that kind of fragmented attention span that they reference. And right. I think it's really critical in the developmental stage, right? 26, 27 is kind of when that people come fully developed. That's a really long window of time.
Yep.
So, everything you've shared is incredible. And what I'd like to ask is, throughout this time, in terms of your 18 plus years of both clinical work and experiences and PhD and actual experience, Are there any kind of significant things that influenced you in how you kind of show up in your role for parents or teenagers? Like you mentioned the one when you were a senior, but anything else that you kind of developed and grew, like how you wanted to bring it to light?
Oh gosh, I'm sure there's like so many, Adam, but I think again, rather than pulling one specific one, I thought that one in high school really did stick with me. But I think something that's also really shaped how I approach my work is, I use a theoretical framework, but everything about therapy is so personalized and nuanced to the individual and the type of symptoms they're presenting. But I've had what I think of as a really great experience and challenge getting to work with teams or groups of people. And when I say that, I also mean like a family is a whole family unit, and every individual person I'm working with, regardless of their age, is coming in with their own history, their own background, their own set of experiences, their own hopes and dreams, which all influence the emotions they have about a present situation, which influence how they perceive a situation. And so some of the most impactful experiences in my line of work have been working with a family, or if I'm working with students to a group of students or teens to resolve a conflict, or if I'm working with adults to build community and team building, coming from that lens of, I guess at its core, that's empathy, but really trying to understand that everyone is coming forward with probably the best of intentions, but their own background as part of it. And part of what I like to do and what I enjoy doing is finding the common thread, right? So I'm sure you do this a lot as a leader in a firm, working with adults. But where is the commonality here? If we are in a conflict, how can we move forward knowing what that commonality is that kind of bonds us all together? And I think I've gotten a lot out of doing that over the past 10 plus years. And I find that is a really good framework for me in working with any parent or child or team of individuals.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, I love the term thread. I use that a lot.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, because I think
that's great.
That's the connection, right? Like it's putting pieces together that kind of help you move forward and grow, right? Like nothing, for example, to pull it back, at the firm, we have these 4 pillars: spiritual, mental, physical, and financial. And as a financial firm, more often than not, people are like, what do these other 3 really mean? Like, how are you bringing these in here, right? And I think that's the misnomer is people think about those pillars mutually, meaning they're kind of mutually exclusive. What does my financial wellness have to do with my physical wellness? My mental wellness have to do with my spiritual wellness, right? I love the fact that you mentioned purpose, right? Like that's a huge one. We all know, for example, your all-cause mortality actually shoots up after retirement because, right, that thing that you have done, whether you loved it or not,
Sure.
Is gone, right? You walk out the door and there's that disconnect. And if you haven't done the work to prepare for whatever is next, be it second career, third career, fourth, with in terms of longevity these days, right? We're talking now in second, third, and fourth careers, right? Like you got to do that work. Otherwise you're going to walk out and it's not going to be, I'm going to play golf every day, right? Like that lasts a few months and then that ship has sailed. But it's back to that purpose piece. And that's why I mentioned is like the idea that none of this is me. They all are so interconnected in that framework. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting hearing you talk about it with adults, which makes complete sense. But I see that so much with teenagers too, right? I think oftentimes teenagers today are like, well, I'm going to go to school. I'm going to get the best grades I can. And if I'm a good student, that works out really well for me. If school doesn't come naturally to me, that's even harder in terms of finding my purpose. But the thing is, getting good grades, doing the school, oftentimes that's not actually helping them find what their purpose is. It can, I think, if the work and the learning is really meaningful or they feel like they have some ownership over it. But oftentimes we have kids who we have kids who are launching, who are incredibly successful in terms of getting good grades, but don't have a great sense of meaning in their life. And so I do talk a lot, particularly if I'm working with kids who are depressed or with families, about, what is it that's bigger than yourself that we can get you connected with? And that makes sense with retirement, right? Because I think all of us want to make meaning of our life experience. And for most teens, they want that too in their own developmental sense. And that's one of the biggest protective factors against depression or feelings of isolation, is when you feel like you're a part of something bigger than yourself, or that you're doing something that's meaningful. So that is definitely, and none of it's in isolation, right? As you mentioned, a kid is, it can't be in isolation from their school life is so important to them, and that's where they spend a lot of time. Obviously, family life is so important to them. So it's all interconnected in that way.
Yeah.
Which I find really interesting, and always a little bit of a unique challenge for each kid to make it work for them in their own unique way.
Yeah, I think grasping that idea, we talk about it in 3 phases in there. And it's probably work you have seen, but there's some work around pre-personal, personal, and self-transcendence are all, right? And it could be self-awareness, self-identity, and self-transcendence. But meaning, I think about it with my own kids when, my brother got married during kind of COVID, right? So small wedding, music's playing, but my niece and nephew and my 2 young boys, right? Anecdotally dancing on the dance floor, right? They don't care. They're not paying attention, right? They don't have that self-awareness to say, hey, people are looking at me. What am I doing? Yeah. All of those things, right? Yeah. And then this is probably your space that you saw a lot in, right? Is that kind of that self-identity, meaning a lot of teenagers are, it's me.
Right.
And I think a lot of adults get caught in that space too. And it's when can you get to the self-transcendent space? And what I mean, it's not some woo-woo meta type thing. It's really about, yes, I am here, but there's also this way bigger thing around me. Yeah. And to your point about volunteering at the Humane Society or tutoring or, giving back in whatever way, or it's why I'm such an advocate for sports, for example, right?
100%.
I learned so much.
Camaraderie of a team, 100%. Yeah.
And to your point about failure, I told this story the other day to somebody, right? But, cost us a game as a sophomore for the varsity team and the senior, right? Soul crushed, back then, right?
Yeah.
I got back on the bus and every one of my teammates was like, it's not your fault. We put ourselves in that position, right? Even though it was my fault, but they didn't treat it like that. And my point is it's that space. And I think that's what I kind of fret a little bit, is when kids don't have those opportunities and those experiences, or are able to find them in that way.
Right.
So hearing all the work you're doing, I think I wholeheartedly agree, because there's so much overlap between kind of the things I'm talking about and what you're doing on that level. And I think it's a framework of our current environment, society, and everything we're living in.
Right.
So, as we close out a few things, because I have a couple personal questions for you if you're okay with it. But as we kind of wrap up a little bit of this, is there anything else that you see that you would want to share, saying, hey, this is what is really kind of critical? And I know we've talked a lot about social media, just because it is a big one, but to your point, there's a lot of other things that are out there. So anything you would want to leave behind that kind of highlights a few of those items?
I think, yes, as I think about it. Okay. So I'm guessing most listeners are probably adults or in that parent role. And I think, so there's probably a couple. One is, I hear a lot of parents often who I think are really hard on themselves. And I've been known to be hard on myself too. I think that comes partially with the territory. And how I try to look at that is, if you're feeling hard on yourself, or you're like, gosh, should I have done this differently? Or did I make a mistake? First off, we all make mistakes, so give yourself grace. And the other part is, if you're being hard on yourself, that's actually a sign that you're this is challenging work. Raising a human that you care so deeply about is probably the most important work any of us will do in our lifetime. And it's because you care so much and you're so invested that you're being hard on yourself. But that's exactly also why we need to cut ourselves some slack with it. And if there is something really concerning that you're now aware of, okay, well then now you have the awareness, and now we can talk about making those next steps. And we haven't talked about when it makes sense to do therapy, but that's always a question that comes up, right? So I like to think of, when I think about the role therapy plays, I also think there's always this balance of like, sometimes people get really concerned, and teenagers themselves get really concerned if they're not feeling happy all the time. And the reality is none of us are going to feel happy all the time, right? We have a huge range of human emotions. The new Inside Out movies do a great job of explaining that to kids, right? And we wouldn't be we wouldn't be human without a full range of emotions, all of which are really normal. And sometimes we can just often I work with teens about like, okay, this emotion came up, but we don't have to do anything with it in this moment. We can tolerate the discomfort and let it pass. And that's how you really learn distress tolerance. As a parent, if you're noticing the same types of emotions or patterns of thoughts coming up with your kid time and time again, so we're talking about like a higher frequency and it lasts for a duration of time, beyond like, if it's finals week at school, yes, they're going to be stressed out. But if it's lasting for more than a few weeks, that's usually an indicator that you want some help, or that you want to reach out to someone and think about those next steps of therapy. So if it's impairing everyday functioning and the duration is lasting. And then beyond that, also times where if your kid is requesting a therapist, if you have any concerns about self-harm, definitely seek some help. And then the best ways to do that are, you'd be surprised at how incredibly helpful your pediatrician can be in terms of making personalized referrals in your area. There's websites like Psychology Today where you can put in your zip code and get connected to a therapist if you need that. Most therapists that I know will do like a free phone consultation to see if you're the right fit, things like that, if you feel that therapy is the next step for your kid, right?
That's great. Thank you for sharing. No, I think that's right. Like, because that term it doesn't carry the same stigma it did, for example, when I was young, right? Like by any means, right? It's much more open and used, and I think it's because it's used much more and we're talking about it much more. I think that what you just pointed out is really critical. Is like, hey, when, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
my kid came home unhappy today. Like, should I consult someone or like? Actually, no, right?
Not for that. No,
exactly.
No, that's normal. And yep, we're going to have those days, and we have those days as adults. And actually, we can have a whole string of those days sometimes if something really challenging is going on. But if it's the duration is longer than you would expect, or something about it feels really intense, that's when you probably want to be. Your gut instinct as a parent can really tell you a lot, I think.
Yeah, that's great. And I promised. So you used the term discomfort.
Oh yeah.
So one of my favorite books, I close out our conversations often with this, but one of my favorite authors and books, he's written two now, but it's The Comfort Crisis. And, he talks about, hey, things are, right, we can be very comfortable these days. Like, back to those phones, if I pulled it out, right, we could have food delivered, we could get a ride, I can do homework, I can have a conversation, I can talk to a chat bot, right, like you name it. You don't really have to get off the couch for anything. And as someone who kind of likes the discomfort or likes to embrace it, I wanted to ask you that. There's a term called misogi. He uses it. Sounds like you're familiar with it. We've talked about it here. But do you have one for yourself on the horizon?
So starting my own practice and business feels like a big one for me this year, which I'm really excited about. And, is really, I think, a great thing for this next season of my life. But my other kind of like mission that I've taken on this year, maybe mission's too strong of a word, is that I'm at a stage where I am able to say yes to more things. Like, and when I say that, I mean like, I'm going to try saying yes to more opportunities that get me outside my comfort zone. Good. And there's times in your life, when my kids were much younger, where I wouldn't maybe have been able to do that. And not to be confused with overcommitting myself, which I'm very good at saying no to certain things, but saying yes to things that might like really, really get me to try something new or something that I hadn't thought of before, because that's usually where you can find some really fun growth opportunities and experiences. So yes. And if any of my friends are listening, I'm sure they're going to have lots of challenges for me this year.
I love it.
But I'm going to try that.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm happy to share. We do in one of our exercises in one of our coaching programs, we do a bucket list. And so let me know. I'm happy to send you the PDF.
I love that. Please do.
But one, congratulations.
Thank
That
you.
is amazing.
Thanks.
Most importantly, everything you shared today is incredible. So if someone wanted to search you out, right, because they wanted to have a deeper understanding, maybe they are feeling that need, where can they find you in your new practice?
Yeah. So I have 2 locations in Northeast Ohio. One is in Beechwood, one is in Hudson. And the easiest way to probably find me is online. My website is Dr. Nicole Pucci. I feel like should I spell that? Because probably
Sure,
people
please
don't know
do.
my name. Dr. Nicole, Nicole, last name Pucci, P as in Paul, UCCI.com. So drnicolepucci.com. And I'm happy to, I do offer like a free phone consult. And if I'm a good fit, great. If you need something more specialized, I luckily know lots of people in the area who are also great at things that I maybe don't specialize in. So always happy to help.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much. Congratulations. Good luck.
Thank
Let
you.
me know when you pick your Misogi beyond the one that opening a practice and being an entrepreneur, because I know that's a monster anyways.
Yeah, that one's taking up my time right now in a great way.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks again. And join us on the next time on the Journey podcast.